Tonight, our main story regards the war in Syria. And just in case the president happens to watch this, I've asked my writers not to exceed a third grade vocabulary for this piece. The big question everyone seems to ask with Syria is why? Why did the conflict begin? Why has it continued? And why have various global powers joined? And I'll get to each of these questions, but I think I first need to briefly explain what the conflict is. So, Bashar al-Assad became president in 2000 after the death of his father. He quickly took measures to ensure his continued control, including reducing the number of people in his inner circle, increasing the presence of security agencies, and cracking down on peaceful protests. Part of this crackdown on protests included detaining 51 people involved in a protest on April 29, 2011. One of these protesters, 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib, was tortured and killed by the Syrian government, which sparked large-scale protests of citizens demanding governmental change. Initially, Assad was not concerned by the protesters, who he condemned as terrorists, but as the number of protesters grew, so did Assad's concern. He eventually sent tanks into the protests and allowed officers to beat and kill many of those involved. Fairly quickly, protesters broke off into smaller groups with more specific goals. One of these groups joined with ISIS, which now prefers to be called the Islamic State, or simply IS. And if you don't respect the naming wishes of terrorist groups, what do you respect? So, there are now several opposing groups fighting in Syria. To help explain this to the president, I'll be using beloved fast food mascots to identify these groups. So first, we have the Assad government, represented by the Burger King, which has a relatively small number of fighters, but the army has massive firepower, including chemical weapons. We also have the various rebel groups, often lumped together, many of whom are former military personnel, like Colonel Sanders here. Then we have the rebels aligned with IS, represented by the Hamburglar. They've led brutal attacks mainly in northern Syria, which you've probably heard about. Now, the US has tacitly supported the main rebels, but has not provided them with any funding or assistance. Instead, the US trained a group of people to fight IS called the Syrian Democratic Forces, aka Little Caesar. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran, represented by the Starbucks lady and Ronald McDonald, have given their support to the Assad regime by providing weapons, funding, and soldiers. So that's basically where the conflict is right now. The Assad regime, backed up by Russia and Iran, is fighting rebel groups made up of mostly civilians, some with military training. Both of these groups are fighting IS, which is also being fought by the US-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, as for the question of why the revolution started, there are literally dozens of reasons that have been given by political scientists and theorists, but I'll describe just a few. The immediate cause of the large-scale protests was the murder of Hamza al-Khatib, but the reason for that event was the increased security agencies in Syria and their increased power under Assad. The Syrian government was spying on people, and their response to undesired behavior was harsh, to put it mildly. The revolution also had economic motivations. Assad had imposed neoliberal economic policies, which increased the wealth gap, left many manufacturers without work, and decreased the size of the agricultural industry. These agricultural difficulties were exacerbated by a drought in the region. This has led some to propose that global warming was the cause for the revolution, as global warming may or may not have contributed to the drought and related food and water shortages. There's also the related question of why the revolution turned into a civil war. Several other countries in the region experienced similar citizen-led uprisings, but none of them became a war in the way that Syria's did. The reason for that isn't clear, but I have a few ideas. Since we're now moving away from facts, let's turn on the speculation filter. Thank you. So, I believe the combination of Assad's deep desire to remain in power and the high degree of control he had over the country partially accounts for the escalation of the revolution. The strength of the intelligence agencies and armed forces allowed Assad to prevent being overthrown, which has meant the war rages on. I also think foreign involvement prolonged the conflict and contributed to Assad's desire to maintain his position. Being backed up by Russia and Iran has given Assad greater confidence in his ability to defeat the rebels, thus prolonging the war. Okay, that's all the speculation. Thanks. As for why Russia and Iran joined the fight, Syria is a major ally for both of them. Russia worried that if Assad fell from power, it would lose its influence over the Middle East, as well as a crucial trading port in Syria. Iran's motivations are somewhat different. Iranian leaders are afraid that their rival, Saudi Arabia, is gaining power, and they believe that if Syria's government falls, the Saudis are all but guaranteed to become the main power in the region, leaving Iran in the dust. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning the immense cost this war has had on people both in Syria and in the rest of the world. 500,000 people have been killed during the past 8 years of conflict, most of them by Assad's forces. Another 2 million have been injured, and nearly 7 million Syrians have been displaced. Obviously, this is extremely difficult for those who have lost their homes and their loved ones, but it's also caused a refugee crisis around the world. Turkey, a country near Syria, has taken in roughly 1.7 million refugees and has helped countless others get to safety in Europe. This has caused a huge economic strain on Turkey, which has worked with the World Bank to provide protections for refugees. And many other countries have also made sacrifices to help those left without a home during the conflict. And only one country refused to accept Syrian refugees and imposed a travel ban on all people coming from Syria. But the situation inside Syria is much worse. There are dozens of cities that are reduced to ruins and dozens more that are unsafe to live in. Even hospitals in Syria are understaffed and unprepared for the many people coming through them. Watch as a Western journalist discovers this while making a documentary about Syria.
We are receiving almost 100 cases from
100 cases a day?
daily.
How are the sanctions impacting your work here?
الحظر على سوريا أدى إلى صعوبات كبيرة في استخدام الأجهزة الموجودة عندنا بسبب عدم توفر الأدوات اللي ممكن نصلح فيها الآلات الموجودة عندنا.
Do you ever get scared?
Never and ever I will not, because we are believing in God.
Does that happen a lot? The electricity
No
just goes
problem.
off?
About 15 seconds will coming.
Okay.
Don't worry. 15 seconds. Don't worry.
This is definitely not easy conditions to work under.
We've probably all seen clips like that before, but I'd like to share a clip that I found more harrowing of that same journalist in the streets of Aleppo.
Oh, careful. Every corner there's these tarps which are put up to try and block snipers' views because the opposition are literally just down there. We're hearing several mortars very close to this area. Wait.
Now this is a sniper list. Stop shooting here.
There's a sniper down there.
You should run.
Go, go, go. There's just sniper corners all around Aleppo. Fucking hell.
As scary as this all seems, there isn't very much we can do. The best thing to do is donate to organizations providing help to victims both in and out of Syria. Two of my favorites are Save the Children and the International Rescue Committee, and their links are right down here. The situation in Syria is complicated and difficult, and for some reason it's making me really hate Burger King.